I'm told that we live in dark times. So for a moment, let me take you back to our golden age. Our golden age was the 1950s, wasn't it? We're in the USA. We're in the Beverly Hills Hotel. There's a meeting there of the Screen Directors Guild. And Cecil B. DeMille is up on the podium and following the dictates of the House of Un-American Activities and Joseph McCarthy, he's having a go at communists, intellectuals, and Jews. And his real target, though, is Joseph Mankiewicz, who was the screenwriter, along with Orson Welles, of Citizen Kane. And DeMille is ranting, basically, ranting and raving, and someone gets up who hasn't said a word up until that point. And in that clipped American frontier speak, he says, "I'm John Ford, I make Westerns," and proceeds to shred DeMille. And DeMille can't get the head of Joseph Mankiewicz on the plate, and he loses the motion. And again, like Ford, I'd like to say that I'm Peter Lyssiotis and I make books. A couple of things. I don't think a little bit of silliness is out of character. So I'm here in Sydney and I'm staying with Nicholas and Jeannie, and the dinner table's a bit wobbly. So Nicholas reaches out and picks a novella out of the bookshelf, puts it under the wobbly leg, and we proceed with our dinner. But I'm just wondering whether that deeply embossed square impression that the table leg leaves on George Orwell's Animal Farm, which is the small novella, is indeed an embellishment. Because isn't Orwell saying to us what happens in a closed society? That if we close off our society like the Soviets do, any amount of evil can happen. That was the first one. The second one, when Monica and I were walking up to her front door, there's an overhanging jacaranda tree, which has been bothering her for the last 30 years, I think, because its root system stops her from preparing a proper veggie patch. Anyway, walking up the stairs, she snaps a twig from the jacaranda and puts it in the book that she's carrying, which just happens to be Defoe's A Journal of a Plague Year. Now, I'm wondering whether that too becomes, over time, when the twig, the flower, the leaves leave their stain on that book, whether that too becomes an embellishment, because it sets up that sort of contrast between nature and the plague. Anyway, maybe. We'll put that to one side and maybe come back to it a bit later. I'd like to dedicate this presentation to Peter Harrell, because books loved him. I don't really have a dissertation to road test here, nor an academic position to fortify or a theory to promote. I don't even have a job. But I'll try to, so I don't feel like I'm obliged to follow the usual narrative. So there's going to be a few bumps along the way. But there will be fragments, because fragments are the language of our times. In a world which exploded some time back, if you remember Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Bikini Atoll, Maralinga, Harrisburg, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, we're living through how many wars this minute in the Americas, Africa, Asia, Middle East, and Europe? Someone, of course, has done the maths. and worked out that between Hitler's rise to power and Stalin's death, a span of just 20 years, 100 million people were slaughtered in wars. So how do we wake up in one piece with a record like that perched on our bedside tables? But we do. But we wake up in pieces more often than not. Artist books or illustrated books are well placed to make something of these fragments because they too exist in the cracks between the visual arts and writing. They can cope with fragments because in the space between the fragments, there are other worlds, and other worlds exist. But what they can't do is stitch all the broken bits together. Even though boy genius Mark Zuckerberg commands us and his employers to move fast and break things. An introduction. The first rule of book club. Not everyone has taste, but everyone has stories to tell. It's through stories that we shape meaning. And at each telling, each reading, each writing, we embellish these stories. If we neglect our stories and stop telling them, then they will die. And once they die, we won't remember who we are or where we are. Unembellished, both we and our stories rot. Would the codex survive this? Probably, but it would fade into a beige dullness. And in this, it's much the same as our lives and our language, both of which are married to the book. And we'll forage a little bit today, as well as having fragments. So time to forage. What would we be left with if our speaking and writing remained unembellished? Both things would be poorer. Look at our Australian version of English. Had the convicts not ripped English off Britain's tit and embellished it with their slang, which is called flash language, then fair dinkum, we might still be speaking real English, which wouldn't be bonza at all. Also consider how much our language has been enhanced by black vernacular English. Its embellishments have speeded standard English's move towards the moral arena. Just listen to Martin Luther King's swooping cadences. Listen to Samuel Jackson in Pulp Fiction. See if you forget the words, but can do with the sound. Good. Let's forage some more. What would happen to our singing if our songs weren't embellished? Like language and books, time would have strangled them a long time ago. For example, there's over 400 recorded versions of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. All of them the same song, all of them the same, but all of them different. I only know 4 of the 400, so I'm not doing too hot. There's Leonard Cohen's Hebrew hymn. There's Jeff Buckley's ecstatic sexual reading. There's K.D. Lang's anthem. And there's John Cale's version with its dark nod towards Dylan Thomas's Under Milkwood. Making books, embellishing them, as well as reading them, is about drifting. The embellishments we add to the codex should guide our drifting. If they don't, then they're just decoration. And faced with decoration, we abandon drifting and just gawk. Flaubert told us that stupidity is characterized by wanting to draw conclusions, to come up with definitive answers which close an issue permanently. So I would never want to codify the embellishments that are there to use when making a book. The second rule of book club. Let's keep ourselves and our books open to the element of surprise. The book is an abiding and permanent mystery into which we drop the contradictions of our living. How often have you come across the plot of your own life in a book? And know that books begat books, just as writing always happens in the shadow of our reading. Books are an excuse to reimagine our lives and to imagine the lives of others. They're a way to come to some reckoning with the people around us and a way of getting to know ourselves and the stories that we tell together. And as such, they're an antidote to the fragments which surround us. The artist's book or the illustrated book welcomes chaos. Remember, Mallarmé told us that all life exists to end in a book. Ready to forage again? Okay. When whiskey is transferred to casks and sealed, a small part of it evaporates. But that's okay. That's part of the process. It's called the angel's share. Something like that happens every time I set out to make a book. I say to myself, you've been making these things for 40 years. You're good to go. Embellish the living daylights out of this in the name of William Blake. Come on, pony up. But then daylight hits. And by the time I get to the making of them, the book calls my bluff and my rampant intentions evaporate, carried off by the same angels which accompany whiskey vapour. Another story about the blank page. Third rule of book club. The book takes whatever life can dish out to it. Just facing a blank page makes you want to make some use of it. But white is a humble colour. It never presumes to tell you the whole story. Empty things, we're told, don't like a vacuum. Wrong. Because there is something there already. There's colour, ranging from snowy white to deep cream. Wrong because the paper has a surface ranging from mirror-like gloss to dead matte. Wrong for a third time because the blank sheet has feel or tooth, smooth to bumpy laid to almost hairy. The blank page invites us to take a plunge into ourselves without a parachute. And to drop into the white chaos can be frightening because once we disappear into it, we have to accept that we may well end up on the very edge of forgetfulness. Inherent embellishments. Fourth rule of book club. The codex gives us some embellishments for free. Let's forage around and find a few of these embellishments. These are inherent to the codex, to the book. The book itself might be an embellishment. How? Well, I think of Anna Akhmatova composing that spare, dissident masterpiece, Requiem, which records the horror of Yeshov, and how she memorized and carried the poem in her head to avoid writing it on paper because of Stalin and his thugs. This tells us something about the importance of poetry and its necessity. Does banning or burning a book embellish it? It does something to it, doesn't it? Look at Germany in the 30s, the rise of the Nazis. Look at China under Mao and his great leap forward. And look at Greece in the 70s under the colonels. Aristophanes shares the privilege of having Lysistrata banned by both the Nazis and the colonels. so I'm claiming direct descent there. You know the list of things that are burnt and banned. War and Peace, Stars Capitale, All Quiet on the Western Front, Metamorphosis. You know the authors: Sophocles, Mark Twain, Sartre, Gorky, Pinter, and so on. But can you ever say, I'm working on a book which I hope will be embellished by a band sticker or burnt in a bonfire by an angry mob? Should we ask Galileo, D.H. Lawrence, Martin Luther, Salman Rushdie, or Michel Houellebecq? Is banning or burning books an embellishment or a piece of political theatre? Does it matter? In both instances, books are weather vanes. You can be sure once they start burning books or banning books, that pretty soon they'll be jailing people and killing people. Irrespective of banning or burning, burning or banning certainly embellishes the book because it invests it with a sort of halo. Can the way that a book is distributed be an embellishment? I'm thinking here of Ehrenberg, Eugenia Ginsberg, Solzhenitsyn, Pasternak, Bulgakov, whose manuscripts were copied and passed around secretly. I'm thinking of Poland in the 80s. Anonymous hands would slip a text under a person's door at night. Or more recently, Yang Jiseng's Tombstone, which was banned on mainland China. These are the books samizdat moment. Is translation a form of embellishment? We know that translation, true translation, is impossible. So between the original text and the translation, what bridges that divide? Embellishment. Can provenance be an embellishment? Rodney, are you paying attention? This is a question coming your way. And is there a phrase which carries more cultural capital than saying, when I was in Paris? Well, when I was in Paris, I visited Brancusi's reconstructed studio. There were the sculptures, the curtained-off bedroom where he entertained, the kitchen where I saw a copy of Leger's illustrated book, Le Cirque, on a stool. And there on its cover were coffee puddles, brown circular imprints of Brancusi's coffee cup. You know where this is going, don't you? Yeah. And did I imagine it? No. The label told me that the big Romanian had used the book as a coffee coaster. Does this take us back a little bit to the beginning of this presentation? Maybe. Anyway, like Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, I'll always have Paris, but I'll also have this unresolved question. If I had the dollars and the choice of either buying Brancusi's copy of Le Cirque or buying a pristine copy from the Ursus catalogue for $50,000, which would I choose? Rodney, which would you go for?
I'd go for the pristine copy.
Okay.
That's what I do.
Okay. I was going to ask for a show of hands, but I thought it might be taking it a step too far. But it's indisputable, isn't it, that provenance lends a book an aura. Time to forage again. When two Australians, and it had to be Australians, didn't it, uncovered what they thought was Stalin's wine cellar, they put the stuff up for auction. But were the collectors collecting wine or were they collecting bits of Stalin? That's twice Stalin now, it's got to mention. It's not going well. Does the price of a book embellish it? Can the label "a safe investment" be a book's crowning embellishment? Can rarity embellish a book? Check out how sought after even pages of the Gutenberg Bible are. And I believe Doug Stewart's got a couple hanging around still. Who wrote the book Embellished? Okay, this could be an iffy moment, but let's say a couple of the big lads like Christ and Muhammad had written their own account of their own lives. Would we be more prone to believe in what they wrote? At this point, Christopher Hitchens' ghost walks through the door and says, "Why does God only appear to illiterate people?" Collaboration. Fifth rule of book club. The more heads, the better to embellish with. Working with other people, collaborating in making a book speeds up the embellishment, because in committee collaboration, you're accepting an add-on to yourself, and you're likely to trot out more outlandish ideas, not only to road test them, but also to test and impress the other person. Some of the great collaborations: James Agee and Walker Evans in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, Laurel and Hardy, Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell, Dennis Lilly and Jeff Thompson. Even if you think you're not collaborating with another person, you're inevitably collaborating with history, because remember, books begat books. Two artists who illustrate this point in a very practical way are Oliver Chardin and Adam Bromberg, who have adopted what I call the hermit crab approach to making books, because they choose books and that already exist and make their work in existing books. In one of these instances, they've chosen the Bible, and they've updated the Bible by pasting in images of contemporary dislocation, of contemporary upheaval. I don't like these two people because they intercepted an idea that was promised to me, but it never came because they got it. Collaboration is something like those porous European borders we see now. The point of collaboration is not to colonize someone else, but rather to see if you have the courage to neuter your moves and be willing to engage in a true partnership. Hands-on embellishing. The sixth and seventh rule of book club is that I get to embellish and talk about it. This will be the show and tell part of the presentation. This is a book which I made with a neighbour. This is a book which I made with a neighbour. She is an embroider, and it's a book about touch. You feel the cloth, you see the handwriting, you see the stray bits of cotton thread, and it's bound in a Coptic binding, and the Copts always stored their books like that. I got to that book when I worked out that there was a relationship between text and textile, and what's it doing? The book is another hopeless attempt to resurrect a dead father, or to make that sort of connection you yearn for, only after it's too late. And why the Coptic binding? Well, I hadn't used one up until that point, so it was time. What the what the moon let me see. Sometimes you can work it so the person that's looking at the book can know a little bit about what's inside the book if you structure the cover right. So the me of the title you can see from it's handwritten, so it is something personal. You get the blue, dark blue of the sky, the red of the landscape, and inside there are images that come from an old camera. So there's no sort of hyper reality about the images. And that's the way that the moon lets us see. I liked this book a lot more when a librarian told me it was a folio. Time to forage once more. Terriard, who was a book publisher in Paris at the turn of the century, always encouraged his artists to handwrite. So when he married, for example, Revedy with Picasso, and they made the Chance de Mort, there was a handwritten text. When he commissioned Matisse to make jazz, again, a handwritten text. Once you see a handwritten text, then you know you're in that personal zone. George Matoulas and I made a book called Bridge, and one of its features that I'm really proud of is that it doesn't try to translate the text from, there are two texts, one in Greek and one in English. And one text runs into the other and just continues in a continuum. So there's no effort to try and translate. And in the spirit, I guess, of post-Watergate confession, I've got to admit it was George's idea, not mine. But to forage one more time, Emily Dickinson always wrote by hand, usually on scraps of paper with a text full of dashes. She had a really peculiar sense of punctuation and spacing. She was easily offended by uniformity, and for that reason, she disliked having her work published. So can anyone say that they understand Dickinson's poems if they haven't at least seen facsimiles of her work? Page numbers. I've never been a big fan of page numbers. I take my cue from B.S. Johnson's unpaginated and unbound book, The Unfortunates, where each page is boxed and loose and can be read in any order and still make sense. I'd expect that from a French writer, but to find it in an English author, that's respect. Up until I'd made a book called The Elder Paints an Icon with Peter Harrell, I'd had all my books bound, as you can see. We were getting towards the end of our collaboration, and I asked Peter, who are we going to get to bind the book, Peter? And his response, in a dark, thick Czech accent, which stretched way back to Kafka, said, "Bloody bindings is like a coffin." I immediately became a believer. So the book was boxed in the tradition of Vollard, Skirard, Terriard, and the rest. And this brings us to boxes. This is Unrepentant, which is a homage to the Greek poet Yannis Ritsos. It rests in a box made by Nicholas Pounder and conceived by him. The grey box refers back to the rocky, uninhabited islands that political prisoners were sent to in 70s Greece. The front end paper is black for mourning, anarchy. The back end paper is red, communist red. Playing against all this is the pure white textured title page, whose feel and look spell out hope. Each page is interleaved with tissue paper, So when the pages are turned, there's the bonus of something like a soundtrack. I made a series of little red books, and colour too can be an embellishment. These little red books take their cues from John Hartfield, who worked in Germany during the 30s and 40s. And he's always been in my back pocket saying, use photography as a weapon. Why red? Is it Mao's little red book? Not so sure. Instead, it's this. It's the Gideon's Bible. When I was a kid, at the start of each year, the Gideons, I never knew who the Gideons were, but they did come around to our primary school and hand out these New Testaments. And for some reason, I've kept this thing since grade 6. And it was this that led me to this. It's pimply red cover, and I just tried to reproduce it. There are 4 of these books in the series. I enjoy working in the series. I did find a spoke in that wheel of colour, because apparently, and I don't know whether this is urban myth or truth, but during Mao's Great Leap Forward, citizens were expected to stop at the green traffic lights and proceed on the red. I don't know how true that is. The use of the expanded or fold-out page. This is a book called Leaf, and it sort of places a Greek myth in the bush. And I'd made this book in my head way before I had it printed. And when I went to get it printed, there was the exorbitant cost of having the plates made. But I did want it to open out into gate folds. And being stubborn sometimes, I decided to conceive of the book in the way that I'd thought of it, not in the way in which the mechanics of printing dictated. Some people take the fold out and make accordion books. Even Vogue magazine does. But there's a book called, and excuse my French, La Prose de Trans-Siberian et de la Petite Johanne de France, which is a collaboration between Blaise Cendrars and Sonia Delaunay. Not only was this the first example of abstract art in a book, it unfolded into a 2-metre high object. And the Delaunays were really obsessed with the Eiffel Tower. And the theory was that if you put each of these editions of that book together, they would then equal the height of the Eiffel Tower. 2 things. That sort of thinking doesn't come cheap, and it's impossible to get better at than that. The use of paper. Each paper has its own feel. When I made a book called The Harm Circle, it was made in response to the AIDS epidemic. A friend I wanted to work with and who had a leading You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, took ill. The illness became a cold, which became flu, which became AIDS, which became death. It was an album. And remember the album and how it did all the heavy lifting for our memories, of our memories? I wanted the paper to have the feel of a parched, dead skin. And arch paper was the perfect fit for that. Using drawing and paint. This is Eyewitness, a book which 3 of us made. And it was made using bits and pieces from the newspapers when shock and awe was in full swing. Monica Oppen created the slip case, which has the bars of a prison, which has the blood stain on it, which has the hood that's placed over prisoners' heads, which has the imprisoned person's number. Remember David Hicks? Theo Strasser did the painting on each of the pages. So in a way, each of these 10 copies are unique because obviously you can't paint exactly the same spots twice. And I did the handwriting, which again changes from page to page. None of this, of course, is intended to congratulate Monica or Theo or myself, but rather it's meant to praise the Mitchell Library, whose curators included Eyewitness in the 100 exhibition in 2010, which spotlighted the library's 100 most treasured possessions. At least that's what I was told. The use of end papers. End papers can act as a prelude to the story, even before the title page. This is Why, a play for 2 voices. And sure, there's a human form there, but not in the real sense. The people have been disappeared and are visible only as thermal images seen through the night visions of a gun. There are 4 of those and another one coming. But in these red books, the body count gets a bit high, and I'm not so sure about losing all the time for the causes that you support. I'm getting a bit tired of it. The use of titles. The painter Robert Rauschenberg said the title is the last layer of colour. And I believe that's true for a book as well. And I think I've got a couple of decent titles. A Gardener at Midnight, What the Moon Let Me See, The Shadows We Left Behind, 3 Cheers for Civilization, Guarding Bones. Maybe if Thomas Keneally or Helen Garner had such easy access to titles like that, they might get a Netflix deal. The ideal response to these books is for the reader to think they're looking but to be open, to be flipped, and finding instead that they've been journeying or travelling. It's embellishments such as these which prevent the codex from sinking into that self-congratulatory swamp of paintings and most mass-produced books. Book artists have prevented the codex from developing arthritis. The makers of these books are the people who renew our interest in the book and reawaken our desire for them. Marginalia. I know there's been an entire conference based around marginalia, and people have spoken about it yesterday, but the 8th rule of book club for me is don't go a bridge too far. When I was making What She Wants with Ursula Dawkins, we were getting towards the end, and I suggested we make some fake marginalia. I just read that Graham Greene's library had been sold off for a record price, not because of first editions or books that had been dedicated to him, but because of what he'd written in the margins. So I thought it was about time to start a little faking stuff. And so I went through Ursula's text, found the sweet spots, and wrote things like room of one's own, ? Love this bit, and so would Germaine, semicolon. Very Gertrude Steinish, 3 exclamation marks. And then she sorted through my images and wrote in pencil in the margins, German expressionism, 3 exclamation marks. Caspar David Friedrich here, ? Magritte or Bosch? Ouch. Well, fail again, and fail worse, to misquote Beckett. Time to forage again. Reading through 2 volumes of Beckett's letters, I was impressed by the very detailed annotations, and I know people spoke about annotations yesterday, which are another embellishment. And they added to the Beckett story because they told me on returning to Ireland via London in 1945, customs seized the manuscript of what? Because they figured it contained coded messages to the enemy. Why else would someone write like that? When embellishment becomes ornamentation, 9th rule of book club, never say, look at me, look at me, look at me. When a person ornaments or decorates something, they presume someone else is watching and waiting to be amazed. Boy George said it a few years ago when he and Culture Club sang about kissing to be clever. Embellishments shouldn't be window dressing, although there's always that temptation there, isn't there? Like those syrupy Greek sweets or French nouvelle cuisine, where embellishment can at first lick be so yummy, but in the end, all you end up with is a gut ache in your brain. I've seen the best books of my generation burnt, sculpted into shapes, arranged to look like furniture, cut into letters of the alphabet, made into walls to close off doorways and turned upside down, suspended and made to look like the wings of birds. It's not for me. Although I do have to acknowledge Martha Minuin, who built the Parthenon during Documenta 14, and her building blocks consisted only of books that had been banned. The Age newspaper recently told me that I could commission a book stylist, and the book stylist would curate my books. Just wondering whether we could justifiably say that such a move could embellish your library and even yourself, once your books were colour coordinated, arranged according to size, or separated into countries of origin. Ornamentation may also be established through developing a brand. Philip Roth tells us that developing a brand can lead to celebrity, if that's what you're after. And we see it in P.G. Wodehouse's bungling upper crust aristocrat in England, Salvador Dali's soft watches, Elvis's hip shake or his snarl, take a pick, or Robert Mapplethorpe sticks. As a book artist, I think you should be avoiding getting sucked into a signature, because you're on dangerous ground once you develop a signature and then start to believe it. We've come to the end. Who are you going to call? In the face of fragmentation, of collapsing empires, war creeping up from the end of your street, and the imploding of seemingly permanent barriers of class, gender, and racial privilege, it's time for a hero, and the codex is up for it. But like every hero, it steps gingerly between the lines of self-destruction and self-dramatisation. I was born twice, to steal a line from Geoffrey Eugenides. The first time to a mum in a Greek Cypriot village, and the second time the minute I entered a book. Hunter S. Thompson, the guru of gonzo journalism, described what he was doing as trying to learn how to fly while he was falling. And each time I get to making a book, it's that feeling exactly. As though I haven't yet learned to fly as long distances. I've become, however, really good at falling. And I've learnt that falling is the first and most important skill in a lot of things. And now I'm slowly learning how to fall without breaking, as well as how to break once I've slipped and fallen. Making books has been a way of getting to know the world and myself, and of knowing what I know. By making books, I get to reassure myself in the same way that whistling in the dark reassures me. Making these books gives me another glimpse of what it's like to be stranded. But that's okay, because I know that these books are also my rescue party. Having made these books doesn't mean they've finally figured out what they want to become. By making these books, I know I have somewhere to record my stories, especially those that I can't even bear to tell myself. By making these books, I've understood how they demand time. And if we acknowledge that the final end of progress is to colonise our thinking, then books, with their demands on our time and with their ability to apply the handbrake at the very moment history is telling us to rush, then they might be, just might be, the grains of sand which cause the machine to malfunction or at least doubt itself. Making these books gives me the privilege of putting art made by a human being directly into the hands of another person. These books are on a mission, and that mission is to herald the coming of the perfect book, and the perfect book will sing. And it's libraries like this, librarians like Maggie, Simon, that these who acquire these books in editions of 5, 10, 20, and groups and societies such as this one, which keep these books in a space, which acknowledge their relevance and ensure their circulation. It may be a long roll of the dice, But as Mary Ann Faithfull tells us on her album Broken English, danger is great joy. Thank you.